Once again, glad to be able to stand before you and talk about these matters. And I tell you, I like this format that you have. Having worship and then Bible class and then worship and then you're done for the day. That's a good thing. You know, we have one Sunday at Eastern Meadows where we have church eat church. I don't like that statement, but still it sort of describes what we do. And we have an early afternoon service and come home, and that seems to be a good thing every once in a while, but this is a good format as well. The New Left in the Lord's Church, revisited. Now, the last time that I was here with you, you might remember, if you can remember that far back, that I talked about the New Left in the Lord's Church in our Sunday morning Bible class, and I will be recapping here in just a moment what I meant by that. I want you to think along with me, though, into what the Apostle Paul said in 2 Timothy chapter 4, beginning of verse 1. When he said, I charge thee therefore before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who shall judge the quick and the dead at his appearing and his kingdom. Preach the word. Be instant in season, out of season. Reprove, rebuke, and exhort with all longsuffering and doctrine. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lusts shall they heap to themselves teachers having itching ears. And they shall turn away their ears from the truth, and they shall be turned unto fables. As I pointed out the last time that I was here about this matter, we live in a day in which the truth is being attacked on every side. There is a group in the Lord's church that are very active in trying to transform us into just another denomination among many. And I talked about the origin of this group, how I perceive it to have begun, in the fact that the leaders of this group, which I call the New Left, come from the baby boomer generation. Now, y'all baby boomers out there, don't take offense at that. I'm married to a baby boomer. I'm not a baby boomer. I'm part of Generation X. I was born about 2 months too late to be a baby boomer. But still, the fact is, the baby boomer generation, some of them, and nationally speaking, took the lead in trying to transform the United States in leading a revolution of sorts through the institutions. Don't trust anyone over 30. You remember that mantra? You remember the talk about the establishment long before Donald Trump, long before the squad, long before any of this in politics talking about the establishment. The left in the late 60s were talking about the establishment, and they meant the United States itself. They wanted to take over the colleges, universities. They wanted to take over everything and radicalize it. And we saw, of course, transformed campuses in which there were literal battles on the campuses and battles in the street. And then, of course, there was the new love and the free love of the late 60s that transformed in many ways the moral fabric of the United States. And these radicals in the late 60s were called the New Left to distinguish them from the old left, the traditional liberals that have been in the United States. They didn't want anything to do with that. They wanted to get things done now, and they wanted to push as far as they could possibly go. Well, in 1993, when I was invited to speak on the Christian Scholars Conference about instrumental music, is the use of the instrument in worship a sin? And of course, I took the position, still do, that it is sinful according to the New Testament. This Christian Scholars Conference was and still is dominated by those of this mindset. Fellowship with the denominations. Transforming the institutions of the church. In fact, some of the same language that was used in the late 60s, counterculture, establishment, all of those kinds of things were being used by these leaders in the church. And so after I had my experience, which is described in among the scholars, one of the books that I wrote of the Christian Scholars Conference, I began to pay attention to the sermons and the articles and the lectures that were being delivered by many of those in the leadership. And there were a couple of things that struck me immediately. Number one was what I just described. the similarities between the radicalism of the late 60s and the radicalism in the church today. And the second thing that struck me was that how many of these men came out of the anti-wing of the brotherhood. Now, I don't like that term anti. We've all got to be anti-something. We've got to be anti-sin, for one. But I use that term to describe who I'm talking about. Those of you who can remember know the controversies of the 40s, 50s, and early 60s that destroyed fellowship among too many congregations. Many of the men that lead this current movement came from that mentality. And what they've done is they've taken that same destructive radicalism that divides churches and have transformed it all the way to the other extreme. That was what I was perceiving. So I wrote the book Among the Scholars in part about that. That was in 1994. In 1996, Richard Hughes wrote a book called Reviving the Ancient Faith. At the time, Hughes was a professor of history at Pepperdine University. He has since left Pepperdine. But this book, Reviving the Ancient Faith, was published by Erdman's publishing house. In that book, he spent 3 chapters on the 1960s. This was 2 years after my book came out. So my hunch was correct. The 60s had a profound effect on the thinking of some of these men. What's more, he said about the late 60s and the climate that existed back then, that those who were involved in the radicalism, the children, he said, were the true conservatives, and their parents were liberal. You talk about rewriting history. That's a rewrite. And then he says, judged by the standards of the 1960s, or of the 1800s churches of Christ, you had that situation in the church. Well, my hunch was confirmed. It was not just that, though. During that same time that I was writing Among the Scholars, I was preaching up in the Shoals area of northwest Alabama. That's Tuscumbia, Sheffield, Muscle Shoals, Florence. I was there for about 6.5 years at Spring Valley Church of Christ. And during that same period of time, the largest congregation in the area had a split right down the middle. And out of it formed the Magnolia Church of Christ. And right away, they met with a denominational church in a joint worship service. It made the headlines of the local paper, the Times Daily. Big picture of the 2 preachers shaking hands, and the title said, "An Historic Event." Well, not only did they meet with one denomination, they met with several denominations. Over the course of the next several months, joint worship services, interdenominational fellowship. And their preacher, speaking at one of those services for Magnolia, even said in response to a question, if you have 2 preachers, one that preaches baptism for the remission of sins, one who doesn't, if someone comes forward, what do you say? He said, don't you think we've got enough preachers here that we can work out something that needs to be done? When you read Acts 2 and you find what the day of Pentecost is described as by Luke, when the people said, men and brethren, what shall we do? How did Paul respond? How did Peter respond? Peter should have said, well, we've got the Pharisees, we've got the Sadducees, we've got the apostles. Don't you think we can all come down here to Solomon's porch and work out something that needs to be done? That's not what he said. He said, repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins. That's what needs to be taught. That's what needs to be preached. But that's not what the leaders of the New Left want you to believe and to obey. In fact, Max Lucado, who is a very talented author, very talented speaker, very gifted, in fact, in those areas, wrote a booklet in 1999 that he sent out to many, many churches of Christ in the United States called He Did This Just For You, in which he has you to sign a statement toward the back of this booklet, this tract, and he wants you to recite a prayer. Then he said, when you recite that prayer and sign your name, you are in the family of God. And it's then that he says he wants you to be baptized. What does that sound like to you? That's denominational teaching. And yet he wants you to do that, and then you're saved? Well, folks, that's the kind of thinking, that's the kind of philosophy that's undergirding this movement that I'm talking about. And let me be very clear. As I said last time, I don't like talking about it, and I wish I didn't have to talk about it.
But the reality is, brethren, as you know as well as I do, that there are churches that are in small numbers and large numbers that have been affected and are being affected by this movement because we see brethren who are falling hook, line, and sinker into interdenominational fellowship, worshiping with instruments, doing anything and everything in the name of worship. We have 3 congregations in the Montgomery, Alabama area right now that have instrumental music in at least part of their services. 1 in almost all of the services. And that can be repeated in city after city after city. And of course, you know that as well as I. And now we even see the spectacle of one university among us, Lipscomb, who has a woman teaching men how to preach and sending out women to preach in these congregations. Did you ever think you'd see the day when that would happen? When I was a student at Freed-Hardeman back in 1900 and none of your business, I would go to the library and not just do research for my classes. I'd go in there to read books when I had some time, when I had a little bit of time. And I would dig deep in some of these debate books and some of these other books of men that I respected and heard about all my life from my dad and my grandfather and my uncles. And I would read these debate books about instrumental music and look over these things that have been written, and I would think to myself, and there in the mid-'80s, I've given it away now, in the mid-'80s, sitting there in that library reading these books, I'd think to myself, boy, I'm so glad we don't have to fight these battles anymore. Little did I know. Little did I know. That's what we're facing. That's what we're facing as far as the doctrinal threat that is among us. Because what these men want to do is to have us to be in open fellowship with everyone, regardless of what we teach, regardless of what we practice, regardless of what we preach. And do almost anything in the name of worship. Now, I told you last time about a little bit more about my background, and I'm going to go ahead and repeat it to you because I think it's a factor in my thinking at least. My grandfather, who was mentioned earlier this morning, was not always a member of the church. In fact, he grew up in the Free Will Baptist Church in Lamar County, Alabama. Now, the Free Will Baptist, he always said, was closer to the truth than the Southern Baptists because the Free Will Baptists believe that you could fall from grace. Southern Baptists don't believe that you can fall from grace. The Primitive Baptists, whom, by the way, he would call hard shell Baptists because of their Calvinism, the Primitive Baptists didn't use instrumental music, but they did not believe baptisms for the remission of sins. And as I said, they were very hardcore Calvinists. Free wills were closer to the truth than any of them. That's what he grew up in. Now, my grandmother's side of the family, she came from the Prices. Ray Price, that country music singer, he's distant kin to me, by the way, about a 10th or 11th or 12th cousin, I guess. So anyway, the Prices, that's where she grew up. Now, her mother, my great-grandmother Price, in the 19-teens or 20s, we're not really sure the times frame, she obeyed the gospel because she heard the truth from a preacher that had held a protracted meeting near where she was. The best we can figure, the best we can tell, she heard Gus Nichols preach because Gus Nichols preached for a time in Millport, Alabama, which is in the southern end of Lamar County. That's before he went to Jasper to the 6th Avenue congregation. He was there at Millport for several years and would hold numbers of revival meetings all through that county and the area. She probably heard him preach and was baptized. She obeyed the gospel. But the roads in Lamar County back in those days were horrendous. You could not travel from Millport to Vernon without it being a major operation, taking many hours. I kid you not. So she had no place to go to church. There was no congregation of God's people near where she was. So what she would do on Sundays is she'd stay at home. She wouldn't go anywhere to church. She worshiped privately because she knew the Free Will Baptists weren't right. My grandmother never became a Free Will Baptist. She only went to the Free Will Baptist Church because of my grandfather. She said that more than once. She said, I never believed what they believed, but I went because of Shirley. That was his name, by the way. John Foster Shirley Hester. Everybody in the Brotherhood, when he was a gospel preacher, knew him as S.F. Hester, but it was John Foster Shirley. He transposed his name to be Shirley Foster Hester. Well, everybody in the family knew him as Shirley. Have I confused you enough? Well, all of us grandkids, all of us grandchildren knew him as Pa or Paul Hester. but he was Shirley to the family and SF to the brotherhood. Well, he was a committed Free Will Baptist. He became a deacon in the Free Will Baptist Church and was on the credentials committee of the Free Will Baptist Church. That is to say, he would be one of those that would determine whether a preacher was in the faith or not. Well, in the Depression years, when the Depression hit, he had to find work. He helped build the building that still stands that was Lamar County High School, where I attended, by the way, when I was in high school. It was about to fall down when I was in school. But they finally built a new building, which had been long overdue. But anyway, he helped lay the foundation for that old building, which is now City Hall. They renovated it and got it up to speed, and it's now City Hall. Well, he tried to find jobs, WPA jobs, for those of you who could remember all of that. One of those jobs he had was in a sawmill on the banks of Hell's Creek. Now, you probably don't know where Hell's Creek is, do you? If you do, then, I need to talk to you afterward, because you know a lot more about Lamar County than you let on. Hell's Creek, it is said, is the only place in the world where you can catch fish and you don't have to cook them. Some of you will get that joke about midnight tonight. But it's strongly suggested that you do. Well, he worked at a sawmill, and I kid you not, the name of the sawmill on the banks of Hell's Creek was Damnation. I kid you not. So he was working at this sawmill alongside Lyman Lawrence. Lyman Lawrence was a member of the church. His grandson, Tony Lawrence, preaches at Bobby Branch in McMinnville, Tennessee, and has been there for many years. Very dear friend of mine. Brother Lyman struck up a friendship with my grandfather, and they began to study the Bible on their lunch break. Well, they actually began to argue about the Bible on their lunch break. But in the course of those discussions, those arguments that they had, Brother Lyman convinced my grandfather that, number one, voting people in the church was wrong. And number two, instrumental music was wrong. Well, he was going to tell the credentials committee about this newfound truth he had discovered. And when he did, they said, "You're pushing old Campbellite doctrine." He didn't know what a Campbellite was. And then he heard there's going to be a Campbellite that was going to preach a gospel meeting not far from where he was. Well, it wasn't a Campbellite. It was Gus Nichols. Gus Nichols was preaching in a protracted meeting not far from where he lived. And so my grandfather put on his best suit and walked almost all day to the place where Brother Nichols was going to preach, to hear him preach. He took along with him a pad and a pencil to take notes. My grandmother was expecting my dad. My dad would be born in January of 1940. This is about October of 39, the best we can tell. She was already laid up in bed because she was expecting my dad. He took notes on what he heard. Came back mad as he can be. Clora, that's my grandmother's name. Clora, he can't be right on baptism. I'm going to prove him wrong. He began to look up the scriptures. The more he began to look up the scriptures, the more he began to realize he ain't wrong. He continued to study. He continued to search the scriptures. After the meeting was over, he came to realization, closed his Bible, took off his spectacles, turned to my grandmother and said, "Clora, we're as wrong as we can be on baptism." I can hear him say it. And we was reciting it. That's the way he'd say it. "Clora, we're as wrong as we can be on baptism." He determined he was going to obey the gospel. He went into town to Vernon, Alabama, to visit the preacher at the Vernon Church of Christ. His name was W.A. Holly. Brother Holly had a withered right arm. Had it all of his life. He would attend debates that our brethren would have with Pentecostal preachers who claimed they had the power of the Holy Spirit to heal. And Brother Holly would sit on the front row. And the preacher would know about it, the gospel preacher, and he'd say, "Okay, you claim to have the power of the Holy Spirit to heal? Brother W.A. Holly is sitting here on the front row. He has faith that God can heal him. You say you can? This debate will be over if you go down here and restore his arm as whole as the other." That challenge was never met. Brother Holly was a faithful gospel preacher. My grandfather had a discussion with him, sitting on a log, by the way, sitting down on a log, discussing with him about one particular item that he was still not convinced about. Brother Holly convinced him, and then he was baptized. My grandfather was baptized into Christ for the remission of sins. Now, later on, my grandfather told us in the family about his great-grandfather Brown. J.A. Brown was his name. He called him Pat Brown. He was a Free Will Baptist preacher at the turn of the previous century, the 1800s, 1900s. And my grandmother's father, Papa Price, said that the church where Pat Brown preached almost got into a fight because Pat Brown, a Free Will Baptist preacher, got up in the pulpit and said, anybody that don't believe that baptism is for the remission of sins don't have brains to fill half a peanut hole. Kid you not. He believed that baptism was for the remission of sins. My grandfather, Pa Hester, always said that if Pat Brown had ever heard a gospel preacher, he would have converted right then. Well, that was part of the background too. So my grandfather obeyed the gospel. He was going to tell the church where he grew up why he was leaving. He was going to preach a sermon, why I am a member of the Church of Christ. They didn't allow him to do that. They wouldn't allow him to do that. So he asked his father-in-law, Papa Price, if he could use the living room in his house to speak to the members of that church who would come to hear him. They figured just a few would come. As it turns out, the entire church, except for one person, came to hear him preach. He had to stand out in the front lawn to preach to them. Not long after that, he received a letter signed by every member of that church that said, we would rather see you dead and in your grave than a member of the Campbellite church. He was privileged to baptize his father into Christ. My grandmother was finally baptized for the remission of sins. All of his sons were baptized into Christ. His daughter was baptized. Most of his family were baptized into Christ. As a result of his decision, my dad and his brothers preached the gospel. And I have that one uncle, Johnny, who preaches in the Boot Hill, Missouri still. As a result of his decision, I stand before you today preaching the gospel. I shudder to think where I would be if I'd never known anything about the truth. But you know, this what I'm talking about this hour, the people that are in leadership of this movement would have told my grandfather when he had to make a decision, you don't have to leave where you are. You can stay right where you are and serve God faithfully. I think I know the response that my grandfather would have given them. No, I know the truth. I know what the Bible teaches, and I'm going to obey it. One of the last things I ever heard him say before he passed from this life was he was talking to my dad and his brothers about my uncles, about the things that he wanted them to do after his passing. He knew that he was going to pass away from this life. And he quoted 2 Timothy 4, the passage that I recited to you just a few moments ago. I could still hear his voice. Preach the word. Be instant in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with all long-suffering and doctrine. That's what he wanted to do more than anything. And that's what he wanted us to do. And that's what I strive to do. Not because my grandfather did it, not because my dad did it, not because my uncles do it. No, I come to you preaching the gospel because the gospel of Christ is clear and it's plain and it must be obeyed. There are many times over the years where I've had questions. There's nothing wrong with having questions. There's nothing wrong with saying, am I doing the right thing? Is this really the right way? Is it the only way? Is this plan of salvation the only plan of salvation? Or is there other ways by which we can be saved? And every time I had those questions, every time I began to search, I always came back to Romans, the 6th chapter, especially verses 16 through 18. Paul makes it so clear when salvation is obtained, you'd have to have help to misunderstand it. That's what we say in Alabama, by the way. And unfortunately, there are too many people who have help to misunderstand it and won't help to misunderstand it. The fact is, we obey from the heart that form of doctrine, being then made free from sin, he says. You became the servants of righteousness. That's as clear as it could be. And yet you've got folks today that want to muddy the water. Back in the spring of 1984, I was a freshman at Freed-Hardeman. And those of you who remember that lectureship know that during open forum that week, Rubel Shelley came on campus. That was right after he had begun to make some very uncertain statements about fellowship and baptism, and was allowed to make about a 5-minute uninterrupted statement. I was sitting as far from here to that post from Rubel. I remember it. You could have heard a pin drop in that auditorium. He made a statement. It sounded good on the surface, and Brother Hires, who was the moderator of Open Forum, said, "You said some things that we needed to hear. I'm glad that you said it. But having said that, there are some concerns that we still need to address," and he began to recite some articles he had written that seemed to contradict what he had said just then. I'll never forget that day. Had he changed? Is he really changed? Well, in the many years since, we've seen how far he's changed. And he's not the only one. So many have left the gospel, have left the truth, and are leading brethren astray. And as the prophet of old said, "My people love it so." And that's unfortunate. Well, I've been speaking long enough. There's a few minutes left in this class session. Do you have any questions, comments, or snide remarks? Do y'all talk normally in class? Do y'all talk up here at Tennessee? I know we do in Alabama. You do? Well, okay. Well. Question? Yeah, I think she had a question first. Yes. Or no? Not a question?
No, I'm from
Oh,
Alabama.
cool. What part?
Waterloo.
I know where Waterloo is, absolutely. That's in the northwest part of Alabama, in the shoals. Know exactly where that is.
I have a sister that comes to spend the week just to hear you.
Yes, yeah, we met. She reminded me who she was. That's great. It's always good to see distant cousins. Everybody in Alabama just about is kin. You got to be careful, especially when you come to Lamar County. You got to be careful who you talk about because we're all kin. I never will forget when Daddy was going to move back to Lamar County. We had lived in Tennessee for about 6 years up in near Clarksville, Tennessee. That's where Daddy preached at the time. And so it was a culture shock for me to move from Clarksville, Tennessee at the time. 1978, it was about 75,000 near a military base. And we come to Vernon, Alabama, 2,100, and everybody's in town on weekends. That was a culture shock. But I began to love it. I loved growing up in a small town. Loved growing up in the place where all my ancestors were from. Loved it. Still do to this day. But yeah, my dad, when he was holding a gospel meeting that spring, and I traveled down there with him. There's a story behind that too, by the way. We come to Vernon, and he stopped at a gas station to get gas. He went in to pay for the gas. He was in that gas station for about 15 to 20 minutes. He came out and said, "I found out that he's my third cousin." I said, "Really? Really? You're kin to this guy, you know?" Well, in that trip, by the way, that we made from Clarksville to Vernon, my dad had just had major surgery about 2 weeks before. I did not know this until I was in college. Okay, he and I sang a song from the songbook that he wanted me to learn. We sang a verse or two out of the songbook. He later told me when I was in college, over the telephone, by the way, the only thing I remember of that trip was us singing that song. I said, "What? You drove all the way from Clarksville to Vernon, and the only thing you remember was singing that song? I put my life in your hands, really?" Well, anyway, that's my mind. My mind goes 1,000 different ways. Another question, yeah.